Well, I guess you know why you're here. You're here because Blizzard is lifting the AoE hard cap that they have introduced in Shadowlands in many of its abilities. That's right, they went there. Blizzard is currently in full emergency mode in Break the Glass, click the big red button, Operation Restore Our Public Image. They have been starting on a warpath of positive, great even, changes announced in 9.1.5. Some were even hotfixed to be live immediately. We went over the covenants being freely swappable, the removal of conduit energy, anima being much easier to farm, stacking all the way up to 200,000, likely being transferable to alts, being able to skip the entirety of the Covenant campaign. Now we even have the info that you can skip the entirety of the Korthia campaign on alts and other characters, so great changes. But now Blizzard surpassed itself because they went for the AoE cap. The AoE cap wasn't even in the top 5 things in the wish list of people for 9.1.5. And not because it was not very important, it's just because people gave up. They had no hope that this change could be pushed in a mid-tier patch. Most people were expecting this to come something like in the next expansion, if even that. It wasn't something that Blizzard would have been able to push in a minor patch in between tiers. And yet, situation I guess must be so dire that they're going to pull this one out. So there is a bunch of stuff to talk about with this. Number one, of course, are the specs getting these changes being buffed? What's gonna happen to the specs that are not being touched by these changes? Are they gonna be weaker? If, for example, a spec that was doing most of its damage without being hard capped was doing okay AoE damage, what happens now? What happens now that there are gonna be multiple specs able to be buffed from this change? Are all the other specs effectively going to be nerfed because these specs are going to become stronger? That's going to be one interesting thing to talk about. The other interesting thing is the fact that, people are somewhat confused about what the AoE cap means. Blizzard is certainly not making it easier with their wording and their text when they refer to the AoE caps. You start reading the tooltip of iBeam and it's telling you that it's going to do reduced damage to secondary targets. And you're like, okay, I guess that's one type of AoE damage. But then you read Wake of Ashes and it says damage reduced on secondary targets. Okay, well, they just inverted damage reduced with reduced damage. I guess it's just a one-off thing. No, Touch of the Magi is going to do reduced damage to all nearby enemies, maybe even reduced damage to other nearby targets. Why not? Damage reduced to all other nearby enemies. Let's just introduce new terminology. Reduce damage to secondary targets for Breath of Sindragosa, and why not finish with reduced damage to all other enemies? So you have 7 different tooltips using 7 different types of wording to talk about the AoE damage they're going to do. To make this even more confusing, in Blizzard's own post, in their PTR developers note, they talk about, literally, the abilities that remained uncapped were generally the ones that offer lower damage, so even they refer to certain abilities as being uncapped. The reality of the situation is that in the game there are 4 types of ways in which your damage can hit multiple targets. The first type is uncapped. So real uncapped means no types of limitation, and this is barely even in the game when it comes to damage. This is what is going to be touching mostly crowd control abilities and healing abilities. So things like Earthbind Totem, Capacitator Totem, Shadow Fury, Shockwave, all this type of CC will be uncapped, as well as the healing abilities. Spirit Link Totem, Healing Tide Totem, Tranquility, Revival, that's uncapped. The damage abilities, almost nothing. Things like Unholy Blight and Unholy Pact, talents for Unholy DK are fully uncapped. Things like Sweeping Claws, the pet damage of Unholy DK is uncapped, and that's mostly it. There is very, very, very few other things that are uncapped. Mostly, it's very, very minor damage. Then you have the hard cap. The hard cap is very self-explanatory. The tooltip says you're hitting 5 targets, that's the amount of targets you're hitting. It doesn't matter if you pull a 6th target in your Mythic Plus pool, you're still gonna just hit 5. And that's it. What Blizzard references when they talk about being uncapped, what you're gonna be reading online when people mention being uncapped, the AoE cap being removed, Blizzard lifting the AoE cap, and all of this, what actually refers to is soft cap. Basically a cap, a limiter on your AoE damage that is so low and so small that still allows you to hit every target. The real thing that annoyed people wasn't that their AoE damage was being capped, was that their AoE damage was being hard capped. So after X number of targets, the damage would not hit anymore. That's what triggered people. Meanwhile, the soft caps still allow you to hit every single target that you are in combat with. Of course, for reduced damage, more and more targets there are, you're going to be doing less damage, but at least you can hit all of them. There are two types of soft cap. One is the soft cap at 20. This is self-explanatory. After the 20th target, your ability will start doing less and less damage. So if your ability is supposed to be doing 100 damage per target, if you're fighting 10 targets, you're doing 1000 damage, 100 each. If you're fighting 20 targets, you're doing 2000 damage, 100 each. But the moment you start hitting any more than 20, it's gonna start doing less and less. For example, if you're fighting 21 targets, then you're gonna be doing 95 damage per target. If you're fighting 22 targets, then you're going to be doing 91 damage per target. And if you're fighting 30 targets, you're doing 66 damage per target. That is one type of soft cap. The soft cap at 20, which is very, very popular. Many abilities, particularly the large, slow, over time damage abilities, are going to be soft cap at 20. Things like Rain of Fire, things like Blizzard, things like Earthquake, things like Mind Sear, Flame Strike, those are going to be soft capped at 20. Then you have the last type of soft AoE cap, which is what is going to actually mean when you read this piece of news about 9.1.5. All of these abilities that you're going to be reading about are not going to get their target caps completely removed. They will simply move from being hard capped at a certain number, 5 or 8 generally, to have a square root scaling type of cap. To make this very, very simple to understand, the way square root scaling works is that you take the square root of the number of targets you're fighting. So if you're fighting, if your ability is hitting 5 targets, you take the square root of 5. If you're fighting 10 targets, you take the square root of 10, okay? Whatever number of targets you're fighting, you take the square root and you multiply it by the base damage of your ability. So if you're hitting with your AoE ability 1 target, the square root of 1 is 1, so that's 1000 damage. If you're fighting 2 targets, the total damage of your ability will be 1410. If you're fighting 3 targets, it's going to be 1730. If you're fighting 4 targets, it's going to be 2000 damage. If you're fighting 5 targets, it's going to be 2240 damage. And the damage to each target is going to be 700, and then 570, and then 500, and then 440. So the more targets there are, the less damage you're going to do to them. Scaling based on the square root of the number of targets you're fighting. That's how this type of AoE target cap works, and this is how all of these abilities are going to work with this new type of scaling instead of being hard capped. So the announcement of Blizzard related to the target cap being lifted is, very simply, we had to introduce in 9.0 a new type of target capping because we wanted to move away from the pull as many enemies as possible, use all your CDs and delete them as the predominant strategy across various forms of content. And of course they justified not removing the caps of several AoE abilities because they were generally the ones that offered lower damage over a long period of time. So Consecration, Blizzard, Rain of Fire, these are not bursty AoE abilities that you want to nerf. They then go ahead and say that we have received a lot of feedback that these abilities not hitting enemies in their range in any way creates a feel problem for WoW combat, but is also an issue for trivial encounters like farming, legacy content. For many of the abilities that underwent the change from uncapped to a strict target cap in 9.0, we are converting the damage to reduced damage beyond 5 targets. This means that the ability will deal full damage against 5 targets and then reduced damage to each additional target beyond the 5th one. So there are 2 things to understand here. Number 1, even Blizzard is referencing to soft capping as uncapped because they mentioned abilities that underwent the change from uncapped to a target cap in 9.0. Those abilities were never uncapped. Those abilities were soft capped before, and then they point out the reduced damage beyond the number of targets. I am going to assume, because the PTR is not up with these changes, we don't know the actual exact numbers, but I'm going to assume this is an example, saying reduced damage beyond 5 targets. I think the number of targets is going to be what the tooltip is already saying. For example, Bladestorm as a base number of target of 8, whereas Divine Storm as a base number of target of 5. I think those base numbers are still going to be the same. It's not that all of these abilities about to be listed are going to be at a default of 5 targets, but still you get the general idea. Now you can finally go back to being sure that if you're a melee guy hitting a full pack of enemies with Blaze Storm, you are at the very least hitting all of them. So the changes in question, we're going to go over them, but that is pretty much nearly all of the abilities that had a target cap. Death Knight gets Sacrificial Pact, Abomination Limb, Reanimated Shambler, Consumption and Bone Storm for Blood, Frost Scythe for Frost, and Bursting Swords for Unholy. This is almost every single ability that is currently hard capped for Death Knight. The only one that isn't going to change, and that's actually pretty big, is Scourge Strike or Hard Strike. This is the buff that is given to you by Death and Decay. Once you are inside your Death and Decay, your Hard Strike can hit up to 5 additional targets, and your Scourge Strike for Unholy can hit up to 5 additional targets. This is not going to change in 9.1.5, so it will still be hard capped at a fixed number. When it comes to Druid, the only changes are to Brutal Slash and Swipe, as these are the only things that were hard capped for the entirety of the Druid class, so there wasn't much else to change. For Demon Hunter, you are getting Blade Dance and Fell Barrage for Havoc, away from a hard cap, as well as Vengeance, getting Soul Cleave, and Spirit Bomb, getting reduced damage. Spirit Bomb is not as big of a change, it's just a slight buff, because before Spirit Bomb was soft capped at 20. So it's moving from being soft capped at 20 to being square root scaling, which is slightly more damage in the like 10 to 12 target range, but overall it doesn't change too much. One of the other bigger changes is going to come to Hunter, because Survival gets Carve and Butchery away from the target cap, so Carve and its talent equivalent. The bigger changes are to Beast Mastery, who gets Beast Cleave off the hard target cap. Multi-Shot and Barrage getting their damage off the hard cap is not that relevant because they do little damage. Multi-Shot especially generally is just an activator. You want to use Multi-Shot for trick shots for marksmanship, and you want to use Multi-Shot for Beast Cleave for BM. You don't really care if Multi-Shot can hit multiple targets, the damage is shit. Very important for BM to get Beast Cleave back on hitting multiple targets, because they were very limited after the change from BFA. It hurt BM a lot. The more important change for Hunters is that trick shots is not getting changed, because the real way for marksmanship to do AoE is to use multi-shot to enable trick shots. Trick shots is the buff that is going to make your aim shot or your rapid fire ricochet to 6 total targets. This number is going to stay the same. Your aim shot won't be able to ricochet to 20 different targets, it will still be capped at 6. At the very least, your explosive shot now gets buffed significantly compared to the previous cap of 6. Mages get some minor changes because they didn't have too much to change there. Arcane gets Arcane Echo, and Frost gets Frozen Orb and Glacial Fragments. Pretty much no more capping for mages. The only cap is to Arcane Barrage, which can hit 5 targets maximum. Paladin only had one thing, really. Red Paladin only had the thing, which was Divine Storm, finally going back to hitting more than just 5 targets. Then you have Rogues, which are probably the more contentious one, because Fan of Knives and its upgraded version, their dot version talented Crimson Tempest, get away from the target cap, away from 8 target caps to being square root scaled, and then Subtlety gets Black Powder, Shuriken Storm, and Secret Technique to be removed from the target cap. The important thing related to this is that neither Subtlety or Assassination can do much more AoE with these changes. It's not that great, it's not that huge of a boost. What is lacking is probably the more important target cap available to rogues, which is Blade Flurry. Blade Flurry is still at the moment capped at 5 targets and is not, at least from here, getting changed. Shaman only gets one change, which is Elemental's Storm Elemental. The Eye of the Storm goes from hitting 6 targets to being square root scaled. Then you have Warlock, which gets the Felguard's Fellstorm for Demonology from 8 targets to being square root scaled. And lastly, you have Warrior. Bladestorm, Whirlwind, Cleave, Ravager, Dreadnought, all are going to lose their cap. Whirlwind used to be capped at 5, Bladestorm and Ravager used to be capped at 8, and then Cleave and Dreadnought as well were capped at 5. So now Warrior is going to gain more more value from their AoE. Warrior was pretty limited in their AoE. It was pretty much just Bladestorm on 8 targets. Most of their burst damage, the rest was pretty limited to 5 targets and less. So these are all of the changes related to the AoE caps, and most of them are going to be removed. So we are going to be left with very, very few hard target caps in the game, and most of which are pretty minor. As I said, the only standout situations where important pieces of a specs toolkit is going to be hard capped is going to be Blade Flurry for rogues, Trick Shots for hunters, and the Scourge Strike and Heart Strike for blood decays, and more importantly, unholy decays. So these are the changes for today. There are going to be a few more we're going to go over likely tomorrow, things like the tuning of conduits and a few other talents, the addition and more info of Mythic Plus time walking for Legion, and even the legendary scrapping system having more info on it. For now though, we can stop with just this video about AoE and the target cap. As I said, I hope it's more clear now that this doesn't really refer to the target cap being completely lifted and completely removed, but it's going to move to a type of soft cap which will at the very least make sure that if you're pulling 10 enemies, you're still gonna be hitting 10 enemies. You know you're hitting all of them, and you don't have some clunky abilities that can only hit 5 targets, even though you know you're fighting 10 of them. So even if this were to come at the cost, for example, of some nerfs, because the ability can now hit multiple targets, I still think it would be better overall, just because you now can feel like you can do more with your build, with your toolkit when fighting multiple targets. We will have to see though, because we still don't know. As I said, there is no info about this on the PTR. We don't have the numbers, we don't have the actual changes, we just have the announcement. So we have to wait what Blizzard plans on doing with this. For now, we can stop here. Let me guys know what you think about this change, although I'm pretty sure it's going to be mostly positive feelings about this. Thank you guys. Anyways, if you've enjoyed the channel, support it however you want. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, Man, it was supposed to be raining for the last like 10 days, and it's getting hotter, actually, somehow. Weather report people are fucking frauds.